The high-pitched whine of the hydraulic lift cut through the night, followed by the satisfying groan of stressed metal. Across the street, the lights of the city's most expensive restaurant, the Gilded Pelican, glittered. Inside, my family was celebrating. They were raising champagne glasses to my brother Ethan and his new fiancée, oblivious to the beautiful chaos I was orchestrating in the valet lane. The first car to go was Ethan's brand new pearl white sports car. Its tyres, which had probably never touched a speck of mud, screeched in protest as the tow truck hoisted its front end into the air. I watched from the cab of my own truck, a dented, rust-speckled Ford F-150 that was older than I was. My father called it a monument to my failure. He had no idea it was the command centre for my revenge. My family didn't realise the symphony of grinding gears and screeching tyres was a performance composed just for them. They didn't know the old rust bucket they mocked was the very tool of their public humiliation. One by one, under the cloak of ordinary city noise, my fleet of tow trucks descended upon the illegally parked luxury cars belonging to my family and their arrogant friends. A BMW, a Lexus, a brand new Cadillac Escalade that my mother had just bought herself as a little treat. Each one was hooked, lifted, and hauled away with cold, mechanical efficiency. The valets were useless, paid off to look the other way for the evening. It was a beautiful, slow-motion demolition of their reputation. They thought their money and status put them above the rules, above the simple red and white signs that clearly read, fire lane, no parking, tow-away zone. They were wrong. You might be wondering why I'd ruin my own brother's engagement party, why I would go to such lengths to publicly humiliate my own parents. To understand that, you have to understand the lifetime of promises they broke, and the one promise I made to myself. It all started 20 years ago, with a lie my father told me while standing in the grease pit of his auto shop. My father's auto shop was my entire world. It smelled of gasoline, burnt oil, and hard work. From the time I was tall enough to reach the tool bench, I was there, sweeping floors, cleaning parts, and eventually learning how to rebuild an engine from the block up. While other kids were playing video games, I was learning the difference between a Phillips and a flathead, the feel of a perfectly torqued bolt. My hands were permanently stained with grease, a badge of honour I wore with pride. My brother Ethan never set foot in the shop unless it was to ask for money. He was 2 years older and, according to my parents, destined for greatness. He was the golden child, the one with the perfect grades and the charming smile. My mother would coo over his report cards, while my father would brag about his natural leadership on the soccer field. My contributions were different. They were practical, not glamorous. "Good job, kid," my dad would grunt after I single-handedly fixed a transmission he'd been struggling with for hours. "You're earning your keep." That was the extent of my praise. My labour wasn't seen as a talent. It was an obligation. The money I helped bring in wasn't for me. It was for the family. It paid for Ethan's expensive tutors, his brand new sports equipment, and his trips with friends. I never complained. I believed I was contributing to a greater whole, building our family's future alongside my dad. The day he made the promise, I was 16. We were wrestling with a stubborn engine on a vintage Mustang. Dad was getting frustrated, about to tell the customer it was a lost cause. I saw something he didn't, a tiny hairline crack in the manifold. I pointed it out, suggested a weld, and in 2 hours the engine was purring like a kitten. That evening, as we were closing up, he slung a heavy arm over my shoulder, his voice thick with a rare emotion. "You see this, son?" he said, gesturing around the cluttered, greasy garage. "This is real. This is built, not bought. Ethan, he's a different breed. He'll have a fancy degree and a clean desk. But you've got the gift. One day, this will all be yours. Miller and Son has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" That promise became my North Star. It was the ultimate validation. I didn't need the praise Ethan got. I didn't need a fancy college. I had a destiny, a partnership with my father, a legacy written in steel and oil. I poured every ounce of my being into that garage, believing I was investing in my own future. I was a fool. For the next 5 years, that promise was the fuel in my engine. I dropped out of community college after 1 semester because Dad said he needed me at the shop full-time. "It's just a temporary crunch," he assured me. "Once we're stable, you can go back." The temporary crunch became permanent. When the economy dipped, it was my side hustle, finding and restoring classic cars on my own time, that kept the business from going under. I'd buy a rusted-out shell with my own meager savings, work on it all night after a full day at the shop, and sell it for a profit that went straight into the family account. That account paid for Ethan's tuition at a prestigious university, his apartment near campus, and his spring break trips to Cancun. My world remained within the 4 walls of that garage. My prized possession was my grandfather's old Ford F-150. He had left it to me specifically, the only thing that was truly mine. It was beat up, the paint was faded, and the engine coughed to life each morning, but it was honest. It was built to work. My family hated it. "It's an eyesore, son," my dad would say. "When are you going to get a respectable vehicle?" Ethan was more blunt. "No one's going to take you seriously driving that heap of junk. It makes the family look bad." They didn't understand. That truck represented everything I believed we stood for: resilience, history, and substance over style. They, on the other hand, were all about style. As Ethan moved through college, my parents began to change. My mother joined a ladies' club, and my father started playing golf at a country club. They bought new clothes. They talked about their new, important friends. I was never invited to these new events. "You'd be uncomfortable, honey," my mother would say, patting my arm. "And besides, someone needs to hold down the fort." I was no longer their son. I was the fort holder, the grease-covered ATM who made their shiny new life possible. The calls from them stopped being about family and started being about finances. "Did the insurance company pay out for that collision job yet? Ethan needs another 1,000 for his books this semester. Can you handle it?" I handled it, every time. I kept telling myself it was an investment in Miller & Son. I ignored the growing pit in my stomach. The final straw came when my father announced he was selling the shop. He didn't tell me to my face. I overheard him on the phone, talking to a realtor, his voice full of excitement. He wasn't just selling the business I had poured my life into, he was selling my future. I didn't fly into a rage. I just felt a cold, heavy stillness settle in my chest. I finished cleaning the last carburetor, wiped my hands on a rag, and drove my grandfather's truck home. I walked into the house without knocking, something I hadn't done in years. My parents and Ethan were in the living room, looking at glossy brochures for luxury condos. The television was on, but muted. They looked up, startled, their faces a mixture of surprise and annoyance at my grimy intrusion into their pristine world. My mother wrinkled her nose slightly at the smell of engine oil on my clothes. "What is it?" my father asked, his tone impatient. "I told you not to bother us tonight." "You're selling the shop," I said. It wasn't a question. My father's face went pale, then hardened. He glanced at my mother, who gave him a subtle, affirmative nod. The jig was up. "We were going to tell you," he said, not a trace of apology in his voice. "We were waiting for the right time." "The right time?" I echoed, my voice flat. "What about Miller & Son? What about the promise?" My father sighed, a deep theatrical sound of a man burdened by the foolishness of others. "Son, you need to be realistic. That was just talk, a way to motivate you. You're a terrific mechanic, the best, but you're not a businessman. The stress would eat you alive." My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "We did this for the whole family, sweetheart. The money from the sale, it's the seed money for Ethan's new venture. He's graduated with top honours and he has a brilliant plan for a financial consulting firm. He's going to be our legacy. He'll take care of all of us. Ethan, who had been silent until now, leaned forward with a smug grin. Look, bro, don't take it personally. It's just a smart business decision. The world runs on brains, not brawn. But hey, I'll always have a spot for you. My firm will need a guy to look after the company cars. You'd be perfect for it. The air left my lungs. A fleet manager. After a decade of back-breaking work, of sacrificing everything, of funding his entire adult life, my golden boy brother was offering me a job as his chauffeur. My father then delivered the final blow. He slid an envelope across the coffee table. There's $10,000 in there. For all your hard work, consider it a severance package. The new owners take over in 2 weeks. We need you to clear your personal tools out by then. I didn't touch the envelope. I just looked at their 3 faces, perfectly aligned in their betrayal. I saw them for who they were, not family, just strangers I had worked for. I turned around and walked out the door without another word. I drove away from that house and didn't look back. I had my grandfather's truck, a duffel bag of clothes, and my personal toolbox. That night, I slept in the cab of the F-150 parked in the deserted lot of a strip mall. The familiar scent of old vinyl and faint engine oil, which had always been a comfort, now felt like the smell of a coffin. I was homeless. I had poured a decade of my life, my youth, and my body into a dream that turned out to be a lie. They hadn't just sold a building, they had erased me from the family ledger, replacing my name with a check I hadn't even taken. The next morning, I drove back to the house. They were gone. The envelope with the $10,000 was sitting on the front step. I took it. It felt disgusting, like picking up a dead thing, but I knew I'd need it. For a week, I drifted. I parked in industrial parks and 24-hour grocery store lots, sleeping in the reclined seat of the truck. I ate cheap gas station food. I was a ghost haunting the edges of the city they thrived in. I felt the full weight of what they had called me a failure. A simple-minded mechanic with greasy hands, good for nothing but manual labor. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on me, telling me to just give up, find some dead-end job at a chain lube shop, and live out the quiet, miserable life they had assigned me. One night, sitting in the dark cab looking at my calloused, oil-stained hands, I thought about my grandfather. I remembered him teaching me how to listen to an engine, to hear the subtle ticks and hums that told its story. He used to say, "A real man builds more than he buys." My father and Ethan were buyers. They bought a new life with my work. They had taken my grandfather's name and legacy and sold it for parts. A cold, hard anger began to burn through the fog of my grief. It wasn't a hot, explosive rage, but a slow, quiet fire. They would not be the authors of my story. I looked at the truck, this heap of junk they were so ashamed of. It was a workhorse. It had a powerful engine I had rebuilt myself. It was reliable. It was honest. An idea began to form, sparked by years of dealing with third-party services at the shop. I knew the towing business. I knew the rates, the calls, the demand. With a heavy-duty truck, a good winch, and a wheel lift rig, I could start my own service. I had $10,000 of their dirty money. It wouldn't be a severance. It would be my first business loan, an investment from the people who were about to become my ultimate motivation. That night, I made a new promise, not to my father, but to myself. I would build an empire, and I would do it with the very truck they despised. I didn't waste a day. I spent $7,000 of their dollars on a used industrial-grade winch and a heavy-duty wheel lift system. The other $3,000 went to licenses, insurance, and a magnetic amber light bar I slapped on the roof of the Ford. I spent 2 full days in the back corner of an auto parts store parking lot, installing everything myself. I drilled into the frame, ran the wiring, and mounted the controls in the cab. By the end, my grandfather's F-150 looked less like a farm truck and more like a predator. It was still old and dented, but it was now my business. I was a one-man, one-truck operation. I called it Legacy Towing and Recovery. It was a quiet tribute to the man who'd taught me the meaning of work, and a private mockery of the shallow legacy my father and brother were so proud of. The first few months were brutal. I lived out of the truck, showering at truck stops and living on coffee and protein bars. I worked 24/7, my phone never off. I plastered my cheap business cards at every garage, tyre shop, and convenience store in a 50-mile radius. My break came from the community my father had abandoned, the small independent mechanics. They knew my work. They knew I was honest. When the big towing companies would quote a 90-minute wait and an exorbitant fee, these mechanics would call me. I was always faster and always cheaper. My reputation grew one call at a time. A family with a flat tire on a dark road, a college kid whose car had slid into a snowy ditch, a delivery van that had broken down mid-route. I wasn't just a tow operator, I was a mechanic. More than once I got a car running on the spot, saving the owner a trip to the shop and a hefty bill. I never charged for the 5-minute fix, just a small call-out fee. People remembered that. Word of mouth became my best advertisement. They didn't know my name, they just knew to call the guy in the old Ford. Years passed. I worked relentlessly, driven by a cold, quiet fury. Every cent of profit was reinvested. One truck became 2, then 5, then 10. I bought a small rundown depot on the industrial side of town and built it into a state-of-the-art dispatch centre and garage. I hired drivers, good men who, like me, were overlooked by others but had a strong work ethic. All the while, I watched my family from a distance. I saw their photos online, smiling at black tie events, vacationing in Europe, showing off their new cars. They lived in a different universe, one built on the foundations of my stolen youth. They had forgotten me. They assumed I had disappeared into the failure they'd paid me to accept. They had no idea I was building an empire in their shadow. The opportunity arrived on a Tuesday, delivered not by a letter or a phone call, but through a glossy post on a local society blog. It was a photo of my brother Ethan and his fiancée, a woman from a family whose name was synonymous with old money and ruthless corporate takeovers. The caption announced their engagement party, to be held at the Gilded Pelican, a place so exclusive you couldn't get a reservation without knowing someone. The article was filled with fawning praise for Ethan's meteoric rise in the financial world and the powerful union of two influential families. As I read the saccharine words, I felt nothing but ice in my veins. This party, this celebration of his unearned success, would be the stage. I knew the location well. The Gilded Pelican was in a newly developed, high-end district notorious for its lack of parking. The restaurant itself only had a tiny valet circle, completely inadequate for the kind of event they were planning. I pulled up the city property maps on my office computer, a skill I'd perfected over years of running my business. I already knew the answer, but I wanted to see it in black and white. The large, convenient parking lot directly across the street, the one everyone used, was private property. A slow smile spread across my face. 6 months ago, that lot had gone up for sale. The previous owners, a large real estate firm, had been one of my first major clients. They'd been so impressed with my company's efficiency at clearing their properties of illegally parked cars that they gave me an exclusive contract for their entire portfolio. When they decided to sell that particular problem lot, they called me first as a courtesy. I bought it immediately through a shell corporation, a numbered LLC that couldn't be traced back to me or my company. It was a strategic investment in a high-traffic area. I had instructed my crew to post new, prominent signs at the entrance and every dozen spaces. They were large, red and white, and impossible to miss. They read, "Private property. Unauthorized vehicles will be towed 24/7 at owner's expense. Legacy Towing and Recovery." They were going to throw a party, and their guests were going to park on my land. Their arrogance was the only invitation I needed. The trap hadn't been set for them specifically, but they were marching into it with a sense of entitlement that was almost poetic. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at my fleet of trucks, gleaming under the yard lights. I called my night shift supervisor. "Mark," I said, my voice calm, "clear the schedule for Saturday night. We have a major private property impound job. I want every available truck polished and ready to roll, and I'll be leading the convoy myself, in my grandfather's truck." The night of the party was crisp and clear. From my vantage point down the street, the gilded Pelican looked like a jewel box, spilling warm light onto the pavement. I sat in the cab of my F-150, the engine idling with a low, steady rumble. I had replaced the original engine long ago, but I kept the old one in my shop as a memento. This new heart was pure power. I watched as the parade of arrogance began, a procession of BMWs, Mercedes, and Porsches, each one shinier than the last. As predicted, the restaurant's tiny valet circle filled up in minutes. Then they arrived. First, my father's sleek black sedan, then my mother's enormous Cadillac Escalade. Finally, Ethan pulled up in his new sports car, a vehicle so white it seemed to glow in the dark. They didn't even slow down for the valet. They led their procession of guests directly into my lot, sweeping past the towering red and white signs without so much as a glance. They saw an open, convenient space and simply took it, as they had taken everything else in their lives. It was their nature. The world was their private parking lot. I waited. I let the lot fill until it was a glittering sea of automotive hubris. I watched through a pair of binoculars as the party got underway. I could see them through the large plate glass windows, laughing, hugging, raising glasses of champagne. I waited until I saw the servers bringing out the main courses. I wanted them comfortable, deep in their celebration, at the absolute peak of their self-satisfaction. Then I picked up the radio. My fleet of 10 trucks was staged 3 blocks away, waiting in the darkness. "It's time," I said into the receiver. My voice was even. "Start with the white sports car at the front. Then the black sedan and the Escalade. Be quiet, be professional, let's clear the lot." The response was a simple, "Copy that, boss." Moments later, the street filled with the silent, synchronized ballet of my tow trucks. They entered the lot without sirens, their amber lights flashing in a hypnotic rhythm. My drivers, clad in professional black uniforms bearing the Legacy Towing logo, swarmed out and went to work with practiced efficiency. There was no shouting, no drama. Just the quiet whine of hydraulics, the clink of tow chains, and the soft screech of tires. Ethan's car was lifted first, then my father's, then my mother's. One by one, a parade of 6-figure cars was hooked and hauled out onto the street, forming a slow, humiliating procession toward my impound lot. The flashing lights began to dance across the windows of the restaurant. A few people inside paused, looking out with mild curiosity, not yet understanding that they were watching the public dismantling of their host's entire world. It started with a single gasp from inside the restaurant. A man in an expensive suit pointed a shaking finger out the window. Then another person looked and another. Soon, a wave of confusion rippled through the party. The celebratory music faltered and died. The doors of the gilded Pelican burst open, and a crowd of elegantly dressed people spilled onto the sidewalk, their faces painted with disbelief. At the front of the pack were my parents and Ethan, his arm still linked with his fiancée's. Their smiles were frozen, melting into masks of pure outrage as they took in the scene. Ethan was the first to snap. He saw his prize sports car, hooked and ready to be dragged away, and charged forward, his face purple with rage. "You! Stop! What in God's name do you think you're doing?" He shrieked at my driver, a stoic man named Dave. Dave didn't even flinch. He simply stopped his work, turned, and pointed a gloved finger directly at the entrance of the lot. I had pulled my old Ford into the driveway, its single amber light pulsing slowly. bathing the chaotic scene in a steady, rhythmic glow. I stepped out of the cab and stood by the driver's side door, my arms crossed. Every eye in the crowd turned to me. I could see the gears turning in my father's head, the furious calculation. He saw the legacy towing logos on the trucks and on my simple black jacket. He saw the heap of junk he'd always mocked. But he couldn't connect it to the ghost of the son he'd thrown away. "Who the hell are you?" he boomed, trying to assert authority that he no longer had. "Call this off immediately. We are guests of this establishment." I took a slow step forward, into the light. "Hello, Dad," I said, my voice carrying easily in the stunned silence. The recognition hit them like a physical blow. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Ethan's jaw went slack. "You?" my father whispered, the word choked with disbelief. This is your doing?" "This is a private parking lot," I stated, my voice devoid of emotion, speaking loud enough for all their friends and new in-laws to hear clearly. "The property is clearly marked with no parking signs. Your cars are here illegally." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "My company, Legacy Towing, is contracted to keep this lot clear." "You can't do this," my mother cried, her voice cracking. "This is Ethan's engagement party." "I can," I said, looking past her to my brother, who was staring at me with a look of murderous hatred. I saved the final nail for last. "And I will, because not only do I have the towing contract," I let the silence stretch for a beat, "I own the lot." The shock was absolute. Ethan's fiancée took an involuntary step away from him. My father shook his head, sputtering, "You're lying." I didn't argue. I simply reached into my jacket, pulled out a folded document, and held it up. It was the deed. The truth, printed in black and white for the whole world to see. Their perfect party had just become the site of their public execution, and I was the calm, quiet executioner they had created themselves.